You were never too sensitive. You were never weak. You were never broken. You were becoming, and most people never saw it happening. If you're an empath, chances are life has tested you in ways that don't make sense to anyone else. The emotional weight, the betrayal, the overthinking, the loneliness, the feeling of being different since childhood. But what if I told you that every tear, every silence, every moment you felt invisible was actually preparing you for the most powerful comeback of your life? Jung believed that transformation begins in the dark, in the unseen parts of the soul, and right now something is shifting inside you. You might not feel it yet, but the awakening has already started. Stay with me, because by the end of this video you may recognize patterns in your life that you've never connected before, and you might finally understand why you had to go through everything you did. And if even one sentence in this video feels like it's describing your life, don't just watch quietly. Join this space, subscribe so you don't miss what your soul is clearly ready for, and drop a comment saying, "I'm ready," so your journey doesn't stay silent anymore. The empath has always been standing quietly in the background, observing, feeling, understanding far more than they ever spoke aloud, and for a long time this quiet presence was mistaken for weakness, even by the empath themselves. They were told they were too sensitive, too emotional, too easily affected by the world, and over time those labels began to sink deep into their identity. But sensitivity was never a flaw, it was perception sharpened to a rare level. Empaths don't just hear words, they feel intentions behind them. They don't just see actions, they sense the emotions that drive them. This makes them deeply emotionally intelligent, even if they never studied psychology, because life itself became their classroom. Every experience, whether gentle or painful, was processed deeply. Every interaction became a lesson. Every disappointment became a moment of reflection. While others moved on quickly, the empath stayed with the feeling, trying to understand it, trying to make meaning from it, trying to grow from it. What looked like overthinking was actually deep inner work happening in silence. What looked like emotional fragility was actually a nervous system so open and receptive that it could detect truth long before logic could catch up. The world often rewards loudness, dominance, and emotional numbness, so the empath learned early on to hide. They learned to soften their voice, to shrink their needs, to carry the emotional weight of rooms they walked into. They became the listener, the healer, the emotional support for everyone else, often without realizing the cost. People leaned on them, confided in them, unloaded their pain onto them, because empaths felt safe. But safety for others often meant exhaustion for themselves. They walked through life absorbing energies, moods, unspoken tensions, and unresolved trauma from people around them, without knowing how to protect their own emotional space. This led to burnout, confusion, and a deep internal questioning. Why do I feel everything so deeply? Why does the world hurt so much? Yet even in those moments of overwhelm, something powerful was forming under the surface. Every time they felt deeply, they were strengthening emotional muscles most people never develop. Every time they reflected instead of reacted, they were building awareness. Every time they endured heartbreak and still chose kindness, they were training resilience. There is a kind of intelligence that doesn't come from books, but from lived experience, and empaths often carry this wisdom quietly within them. They can read the room without effort. They notice subtle changes in tone, shifts in energy, micro-expressions on faces. They can sense when something is off, even when everything looks fine on the outside. This isn't imagination, it's pattern recognition developed through years of deep observation. Many empaths grew up having to be emotionally aware to survive, learning to read moods in order to stay safe, to keep peace, or to avoid conflict. What once felt like a burden eventually becomes a powerful skill when understood consciously. The empath who awakens to their own nature begins to see that they were never broken, they were simply wired differently, and that difference is not a curse, but a rare kind of strength. The turning point comes when the empath stops seeing their softness as a liability and starts recognizing it as training. All those moments of silence were not wasted, they were building depth. All those emotional experiences were not too much, they were shaping insight. All those times they chose empathy over bitterness were not naive, they were refining character. When an empath begins to honor their own emotional world instead of apologizing for it, something shifts. They start trusting their intuition. They start valuing their perceptions. They stop allowing others to define their worth. They begin to understand that their sensitivity allows them to connect deeply, create meaningfully, lead compassionately, and live authentically. The silent strength of the empath is not loud or aggressive, but it is unshakable once awakened. It is the strength of someone who has walked through emotional storms and learned how to stay standing. It is the strength of someone who understands human nature not from theory, but from experience. It is the strength of someone who feels deeply yet chooses consciousness over chaos. When the empath finally sees their own power clearly, they realize that everything they once thought made them weak was actually shaping them into someone emotionally rich, perceptive, resilient, and profoundly capable. Their softness was never their weakness, it was their training, preparing them for a life of depth, purpose, and quiet, undeniable strength. There comes a moment in every empath's journey when avoiding the pain no longer works, when distraction no longer numbs, and when pretending to be fine becomes more exhausting than finally telling the truth. This is the turning point Carl Jung spoke about when he introduced the idea of the shadows, the hidden part of us made of everything we were taught to suppress, deny, or feel ashamed of. For empaths, the shadow often holds years of unspoken grief, emotional wounds, unmet needs, childhood patterns, and identities that were never allowed to fully exist. Many empaths grow up learning to be agreeable, to be the peacekeeper, to carry others emotionally while abandoning their own inner world. They become so good at reading others that they forget to listen to themselves. They learn to hide anger, minimize pain, and silence their true desires because they fear being too much or being rejected. Over time, this creates a quiet internal split, the version of themselves they show the world, and the deeper self that stays hidden in the shadows waiting to be acknowledged. Jung believed that real growth does not come from positive thinking or surface-level self-improvement, but from facing what is uncomfortable and integrating it with awareness. Shadow work is not about becoming darker, it is about becoming whole. For the empath, this process can feel frightening at first, because it means sitting with emotions that were buried for years, resentment toward people they tried to please, grief over boundaries never set, anger over being misunderstood, sadness for the inner child who had to grow up too fast. But within that discomfort lies the doorway to freedom. When empaths finally allow themselves to feel these emotions without judgment, something begins to shift. They stop seeing their pain as proof of weakness and begin to understand it as information. Every wound carries a message. Every emotional trigger reveals an unresolved story. Every painful memory points toward a part of the self that is asking to be seen, not avoided. The true transformation begins when the empath stops running from their wounds and starts listening to them. Instead of asking, "Why am I like this?" they begin asking, "What happened to me? And what is this trying to teach me?" This shift in perspective is powerful because it replaces self-blame with self-awareness. Pain becomes a teacher instead of a life sentence. The empath begins to notice patterns, why certain relationships feel familiar but painful, why certain boundaries feel hard to set, why certain situations trigger deep emotional reactions. Through this awareness, they begin reclaiming the parts of themselves that were lost along the way. The voice that was silenced starts to speak. The anger that was suppressed becomes healthy assertiveness. The sensitivity that felt like a burden transforms into emotional clarity. What was once chaos inside becomes meaningful information. Shadow work does not mean reliving trauma endlessly. It means understanding it so it no longer controls the present. As the empath begins this inner process, they often realize that much of their pain came from survival patterns developed long ago. People pleasing, overgiving, self-doubt, emotional hyper-awareness, these were not character flaws, they were coping strategies. They once served a purpose to stay safe, to feel accepted, to avoid abandonment. But growth happens when the empath recognizes that they no longer need these patterns to survive. This is where empowerment begins. The moment they see their conditioning clearly, they also see their power to choose differently. They begin to respond instead of react. They begin to set boundaries instead of absorbing everything. They begin to honor their emotional truth instead of dismissing it. Jung famously said that, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." For the empath, this realization can be life-changing. Suddenly, their past stops feeling like a random series of emotional wounds and starts looking like a path of initiation. Every heartbreak, every betrayal, every moment of abandonment, every period of isolation was shaping awareness, depth, and emotional intelligence. The pain was not meaningless, it was forming wisdom. It was forcing the empath to develop inner strength, self-reflection, and emotional maturity that cannot be taught through comfort alone. The more they understand themselves, the more they begin to feel grounded in who they truly are. This is why the empath's comeback is so powerful. It does not come from external validation, sudden success, or proving anyone wrong. It comes from inner integration. From the moment they stop hiding from their shadow and start walking toward it with courage. From the moment they stop seeing their wounds as shameful and start seeing them as sacred markers of survival and growth. The empath who completes this inner turning point emerges with clarity, authenticity, and emotional sovereignty. They no longer fear their darkness because they understand it. They no longer feel controlled by their past because they have faced it. They no longer see themselves as broken because they recognize the truth the pain did not break them. It initiated them into becoming someone deeper, wiser, and profoundly awake. For a long time, the empath lives in a state of quiet emotional exhaustion without fully realizing how they got there. It doesn't happen all at once, it builds slowly through countless small moments of overgiving, over-listening, over-understanding, and over-accommodating. Empaths naturally feel responsible for the emotions of others. They notice shifts in mood, they sense unspoken needs, they anticipate discomfort before it's ever expressed. Because they care deeply, they step in, they offer support, they absorb stress, they carry emotional weight that was never theirs to hold. At first, it feels like kindness. It feels like being a good friend, a good partner, a good child, a good coworker. But over time, something inside begins to fade. The empath starts waking up tired even after sleeping. Their mind feels crowded, their heart feels heavy. They feel disconnected from their own needs because so much of their energy is constantly directed outward. This is not weakness, this is what happens when someone gives without limits. Emotional burnout for an empath often looks invisible from the outside. They may still be functioning, still smiling, still helping others, but internally they feel depleted. They feel resentful and guilty at the same time. Resentful because they feel unappreciated, overlooked, or taken for granted, and guilty because they believe they shouldn't feel that way if they are truly kind. Many empaths struggle with the belief that setting boundaries is selfish, that saying no means they are disappointing people, that prioritizing themselves means they are becoming cold or distant. So they keep saying yes when they mean no. They keep showing up when they need rest. They keep giving emotional access to people who do not respect their energy. Slowly, their sense of self begins to blur. They forget what they actually want, what they actually need, what they actually feel, because everything has become filtered through the expectations of others. The comeback begins with a subtle but powerful realization. Something has to change, not because the empath has failed, but because they have finally outgrown the pattern of self-abandonment. This is often an uncomfortable phase because it requires honesty, honest reflection about where their energy is going, honest awareness of who drains them and who nurtures them, honest acceptance of the fact that compassion without boundaries leads to self-destruction. Building boundaries does not mean becoming harsh, it means becoming clear. It means recognizing that their emotional energy is valuable and finite. It means understanding that access to their inner world is a privilege, not a right. When an empath begins setting boundaries, it can feel awkward at first. People who are used to unlimited access may resist, guilt may surface, doubt may appear. But beneath all of that, something new starts forming: self-respect. Self-respect changes everything for the empath. They begin listening to their body when it says it needs rest. They begin honoring their emotions instead of pushing them aside. They begin choosing relationships that feel balanced rather than one-sided. They start to understand that they are not responsible for fixing everyone's problems. This shift is not selfish. It is essential. Emotional mastery is not about shutting down empathy. It is about directing it wisely. The empath who masters their emotional world still cares deeply, but they no longer abandon themselves in the process. They can offer compassion without losing themselves. They can support others without carrying what is not theirs. They can be present without being consumed. Reclaiming energy is one of the most transformative stages of the empath's journey. When they stop overextending themselves, they suddenly have space for their own dreams, creativity, healing, and growth. They rediscover interests they once abandoned. They reconnect with their inner voice. They feel clarity where there was once confusion. Their intuition becomes stronger because it is no longer drowned out by external noise. They begin to move through life with intention rather than obligation. They choose where their energy goes instead of letting it be taken. This is where emotional exhaustion transforms into emotional mastery. The most powerful part of this transformation is that it does not change the empath's nature, it refines it. They do not become less caring, they become more grounded. They do not become distant, they become more discerning. They do not lose their kindness, they learn to include themselves in it. The comeback happens quietly but decisively. It is the moment the empath realizes they are allowed to take up space, to have limits, to rest without guilt, to choose themselves without apology. They stop pouring endlessly into everyone else and finally begin pouring into their own healing, their own growth, their own life. And from that place of fullness rather than depletion, they become not only stronger but truly unstoppable. There is a quiet but profound shift that happens in the life of an empath when they finally realize that constantly seeking approval is draining their spirit more than any heartbreak ever could. For years, many empaths move through the world with a deep desire to be understood, accepted, and emotionally seen. They explain themselves too much, soften their truth to avoid conflict, and adjust their personality depending on who they are with, all in the hope of maintaining connection. This comes from a genuine place. Empaths value emotional depth, authenticity, and meaningful bonds. But when this desire for connection turns into dependence on validation, it slowly erodes their sense of self. They begin to measure their worth through how others respond to them. If they are praised, they feel safe. If they are misunderstood, ignored, or criticized, they feel destabilized. Over time, this creates an exhausting inner loop of self-doubt and overanalysis. The awakening begins when the empath notices this pattern clearly. It is often triggered by emotional fatigue, disappointment, or a moment of deep reflection. They start asking themselves hard questions. Why do I feel anxious when someone pulls away? Why do I feel the need to justify my feelings? Why do I shrink my truth to make others comfortable? These questions are not signs of weakness, they are signs of growth. With awareness comes the realization that no amount of explaining will make the wrong people understand, and no amount of self-sacrifice will create genuine connection. This is a difficult truth to accept, especially for someone who naturally wants harmony, but it is also incredibly liberating. The empath begins to see that being misunderstood by the wrong people is not a failure, it is information. It reveals misalignment. As this awareness deepens, the empath starts to change their behavior in subtle yet powerful ways. They stop over-explaining their emotions. They stop chasing conversations that feel forced. They stop trying to convince people of their worth. Instead, they begin to observe how relationships feel rather than how they look. They notice who listens without judgment, who respects boundaries, who feels safe, and who consistently leaves them feeling drained or confused. This shift from seeking approval to seeking alignment transforms everything. Alignment means choosing connections that resonate naturally, where presence is mutual and effort flows both ways. It means allowing distance where there is friction rather than trying to fix it. It means trusting that genuine connection does not require performance. One of the most empowering realizations during this awakening is that being understood by everyone is neither possible nor necessary. Each person sees the world through their own experiences, wounds, beliefs, and limitations. When an empath internalizes this, they stop personalizing misunderstanding. They stop seeing rejection as proof of inadequacy. They stop bending their identity to fit into spaces that were never meant for them. Instead of asking, "How can I make them see me?" they begin asking, "Do I feel like myself here?" This question alone changes the trajectory of their life. It shifts their focus from external perception to internal truth. As the empath becomes more grounded in their own identity, something powerful happens. Their energy changes. They become calmer, more centered, and more self-assured. They no longer feel the urgency to prove anything. They no longer feel the need to perform emotional labor to maintain connections. They show up as they are, without excessive filtering, without emotional chasing, without fear-based people-pleasing. Some relationships naturally fall away during this stage, and while this can be painful, it is also clarifying. What remains are connections built on authenticity rather than emotional dependency. What emerges is a sense of freedom that many empaths have never experienced before. This awakening does not make the empath cold or detached, it makes them honest. They still care deeply, still feel deeply, still value meaningful relationships. The difference is that they no longer abandon themselves to preserve those connections. They understand that self-betrayal is too high a price to pay for belonging. They begin choosing environments, conversations, and people that reflect their values rather than their insecurities. They speak more slowly but more truthfully. They listen more deeply but less desperately. They trust their intuition instead of chasing reassurance. The moment the empath stops needing to be understood by everyone, they reclaim immense personal power. They become less reactive, less anxious, and less emotionally scattered. They move with intention rather than fear. They choose their path based on inner alignment rather than external approval. This is why the awakening feels like freedom. They are no longer trying to convince the world of who they are. They are simply being who they are, with quiet confidence and grounded presence. And in that space of self-trust, self-respect, and emotional clarity, they become unstoppable, not because they are louder, but because they are finally anchored in their own truth. The rise of the self-aware empath is not dramatic in the way movies portray transformation, with loud declarations and sudden personality changes. It is quiet, steady, and deeply rooted in inner work. After facing their shadows, setting boundaries, and releasing the need for validation, something within the empath begins to stabilize. They no longer feel emotionally scattered or overwhelmed by every shift in energy around them. Instead, they feel centered, present, grounded in who they are. This is what it looks like when empathy evolves from a survival mechanism into a conscious strength. The empath who once absorbed everything now understands their own emotional landscape clearly. They can tell the difference between what they feel and what belongs to others. They recognize when their intuition is speaking and when fear is trying to take control. This self-awareness becomes the foundation of their new strength. A healed empath does not lose their sensitivity, they refine it. Their intuition becomes sharper because it is no longer clouded by anxiety, people-pleasing, or self-doubt. They can walk into a room and sense the emotional tone without being consumed by it. They can notice when something feels off without immediately trying to fix it. They trust their internal signals because they have learned through experience and reflection that their perceptions are often accurate. This trust in the self changes the way they move through life. They stop second-guessing every decision. They stop seeking constant reassurance. They begin making choices that align with their deeper values rather than reacting to external pressure. This is not impulsiveness, it is clarity. Emotional grounding is another hallmark of the evolved empath, where once they may have been easily triggered, now they respond with calm presence. This does not mean they feel less, it means they feel with awareness. They allow emotions to move through them rather than overwhelm them. They can sit with discomfort without panicking. They can experience sadness without collapsing into it. They can hold space for others without losing themselves. This emotional stability does not come from suppression, it comes from integration. It comes from understanding their emotional patterns, honoring their needs, and practicing consistent self-care. The empath who was once emotionally exhausted now has emotional resilience. Psychological strength also begins to emerge in visible ways. The self-aware empath develops discernment. They no longer give everyone immediate access to their inner world. They observe behavior over time instead of trusting words too quickly. They notice inconsistencies without making excuses for them. This does not make them cynical, it makes them wise. They have learned that kindness without awareness can lead to harm, so they pair their empathy with clarity. They understand that not every emotional connection is meant to be maintained, and not every person deserves their vulnerability. This wisdom protects their energy while allowing them to remain open-hearted in healthy ways. The evolved empath moves through life with a calm confidence that feels natural rather than forced. They do not need to dominate conversations or prove their intelligence. Their presence speaks for itself. They listen deeply, speak thoughtfully, and act with intention. People often feel safe around them, but they also feel respect because the empath's boundaries are now clear and consistent. There is no confusion about where they stand. They are no longer over-explaining their feelings or apologizing for their nature. They accept themselves fully, and this self-acceptance creates a quiet authority. This transformation does not erase the empath's past, it integrates it. Every painful experience becomes part of their wisdom. Every period of confusion becomes part of their insight. Every emotional wound becomes part of their understanding of human nature. The self-aware empath does not see their journey as something that happened to them, they see it as something that shaped them. They understand people deeply, but they also understand themselves, and this balance is what makes them powerful. They can extend compassion without self-sacrifice. They can connect deeply without losing autonomy. They can love without abandoning boundaries. Perhaps the most meaningful realization for the evolved empath is that they did not become someone new by losing their old self, they became more fully themselves. The empathy that once felt like a burden is now a skill. The sensitivity that once caused pain is now a source of insight. The depth that once felt isolating is now a place of strength. They did not lose their empathy, they mastered it. And in mastering it, they became someone who moves through the world with clarity, balance, and a grounded sense of purpose that cannot be easily shaken. There comes a stage in the empath's journey that feels less like healing and more like rebirth, a quiet but undeniable shift where everything begins to make sense and the pieces of the self finally fall into place. This is the comeback era, the moment when the empath is no longer searching for who they are, no longer apologizing for their nature, and no longer shrinking to fit into spaces that were never designed for their depth. Their identity feels solid now, not because life became easier, but because they became clearer. They understand their values. They know their emotional limits. They recognize their intuition. They trust their inner voice. After years of inner work, self-reflection, and emotional recalibration, the empath stops questioning their worth and starts living from it. There is a grounded confidence in how they move through the world, not the kind that needs attention, but the kind that naturally commands respect. In this phase, purpose begins to feel less like a question and more like a direction. The empath is no longer trying to figure out what they are meant to do in life. They begin expressing who they are meant to be. Their experiences, both painful and beautiful, start to connect into a larger narrative. The struggles they endured give depth to their perspective. The emotional intelligence they developed gives meaning to their words. The resilience they built gives power to their presence. They are no longer ashamed of their story. They understand it as part of their medicine. When they speak, there is authenticity behind their voice. When they create, there is intention behind their work. When they lead, there is compassion behind their guidance. People are drawn to this kind of energy not because it demands attention, but because it feels real. The empath who once hid in the background now shows up fully without forcing anything. They no longer feel the need to mask their depth to make others comfortable. They no longer dilute their truth to avoid being judged. They have made peace with the fact that not everyone will resonate with them, and instead of fearing this, they accept it. This acceptance is freedom. It allows them to express themselves honestly, whether through their voice, their art, their work, or simply the way they carry themselves. They understand that authenticity is not something to perform, it is something to embody. And when they embody it fully, they naturally become a source of inspiration for others who are still finding their way. What makes this era so powerful is that the empath's impact does not come from trying to change others, it comes from simply being who they are. Their presence alone becomes transformative. They listen without trying to fix. They speak with clarity rather than emotional charge. They hold space without losing themselves. They share wisdom without superiority. This creates a ripple effect. People feel seen around them. People feel understood. People feel encouraged to be more honest with themselves. The empath becomes a living example of what emotional growth can look like, not because they preach it, but because they live it. This is leadership without dominance, influence without force, strength without hardness. The comeback era is also marked by creativity and self-expression. Many empaths find themselves drawn to writing, teaching, healing professions, art, entrepreneurship, or roles that allow them to use their emotional intelligence meaningfully. This is not accidental. When emotional energy is no longer tied up in survival, people-pleasing, or inner conflict, it becomes available for creation. The empath begins to build, to share, to contribute, and to express. They stop waiting for permission. They stop doubting whether they are ready. They understand that their lived experience has already qualified them in ways that cannot be taught. Their work becomes an extension of their authenticity rather than an attempt to prove their worth. There is also a quiet peace that accompanies this phase. The empath is no longer at war with themselves. They are not constantly questioning their emotions, doubting their perceptions, or criticizing their sensitivity. They accept their depth as part of their identity. They understand their rhythms. They respect their boundaries. They honor their need for solitude as much as their capacity for connection. This inner harmony creates stability that cannot be shaken easily by external chaos. They no longer feel lost because they are rooted in who they are. This is why the empath's comeback does not need to be loud to be powerful. It is not about proving anyone wrong. It is not about seeking recognition. It is about becoming so aligned with the self that life begins to unfold with clarity and intention. The empath who once felt invisible now lives visibly, not through attention but through presence. The one who once doubted their worth now embodies it effortlessly. The one who once hid their voice now speaks with natural authority. Your comeback in this phase is not dramatic in appearance, but its impact is undeniable. It is built on depth, authenticity, resilience, and self-awareness. It is the kind of transformation that does not fade with time. It becomes part of who you are, quiet, grounded, enduring, legendary.